Hello, I'm Zachary Tane, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on remotely sensing tree death and stress during drought. The presentation represents a summary of a written report, which goes into more details and includes an in-depth scientific literature review on the subject. Both this presentation and the report have been commissioned by Electrical Power Research Institute, EPRI. The emphasis of this report is going to be on using high spatial resolution remotely sensed imagery. High spatial resolution is generally defined in academia as imagery with higher than 3 meter on a side pixel size. Currently, after pan sharpening, several widely available commercial satellites can actually achieve sub-meter pixel size. So if we're going to detect tree death and stress during drought, I think a logical place to begin is to ask the question, why do plants die during drought? Today, I'm going to focus on two main biotic causes of death, putting aside things like fire and human causes of death during drought. So the first major cause of death is an embolism. You may already be familiar with the term because embolism is also a medical term. Whether applied to humans or plants, an embolism is simply a sudden blockage in the vascular system. Now, plants' vascular system has two major components. One is the xylem, which is in charge of transporting water and minerals from the roots to the rest of the plant. And the other is the phloem, which transports the energy created by photosynthesis, stored as sugar, from the leaves to the rest of the plant. The xylem functions a bit like a bunch of straws. It's a series of hollow tubes filled with water. And as the water in these tubes are sucked by the plant cells, a negative hydrostatic pressure gradient forms. The water is sucked up from the roots without any energy input from the plant, like sucking on the top of a straw. However, if there is insufficient water in the root system, then, like sucking from a straw of a nearly empty glass, pockets of gas can get into the xylem. These gas pockets interrupt the hydrostatic pressure gradient and cause the xylem to become non-functional. If this happens to enough of the tubes that make up the xylem, insufficient water will be transported to the leaves of the plant and the plant will die. Another possible cause of death are tree pathogens. Most every species of widely spread plant hosts numerous pathogens. Generally, a tree can keep these pathogens in check through a number of defensive strategies. One strategy is to produce defensive compounds, for example, tannins in their leaves, and wood that make themselves less palatable to insects and fungus. Another is to produce sap that can pitch out an insect that is physically attempting to burrow into the tree. However, in times of drought, the tree has less resources to devote to these defensive mechanisms. In most coniferous ecosystems across the globe, the most likely pathogen to kill weakened trees are bark beetles. In North America, these bark beetles are often of the genus Dendroctonus, Ips, or Scolitis. Bark beetles kill trees by digging tunnels into the trees, just below trees' bark, such as the one I'm showing you here. Now, just below trees' bark lies the tree's phloem. So these tunnels are disrupting the tree's ability to transport energy. If the tunnel spans the circumference of the tree, then the tree is girdled, meaning sugar cannot reach the root system and the tree is therefore dead. Since landscape scale bark beetle death has happened numerous times in the past few decades, the different stages of tree death when a bark beetle has killed the tree are well defined in the scientific literature. The terminology related to these stages are often used to describe tree death more generally than just bark beetles in the scientific literature. So, a tree starts off healthy. Then a bark beetle girdles a tree, just as I just discussed. Immediately after the girdling occurs, the tree's leaves would look indistinguishable from a healthy tree's with the naked eye. This period, where a tree has been killed by the bark beetles, but does not visibly look dead, is known as the green attack phase. I once heard this described as a tree being too stupid to know it was dead. Even though the tree's leaves remain visibly green during this phase, subtle spectral shifts occur that are detectable to a sensor that can view narrow enough wavelengths of light. Practically, using remote sensing alone, this stage is very hard to detect. After a few months, the tree's leaves begin to fade in color and eventually turn red. This phase, where a tree is visibly dead, is called the red attack phase, and is sometimes used in the literature to refer to any evergreen conifer that has died but still has red needles. From a remote sensing perspective, the red attack phase is the easiest to identify since it is spectrally distinct from most other possible cover types. Particularly in time series analysis, the shift from a green foliage to red foliage is readily identifiable. This phase generally lasts from 1 to 2 years. Finally, once all a tree's leaves are lost, but the tree remains standing, the tree transitions to the gray attack phase. Since the tree no longer has needles, even at high resolution, a pixel containing gray attack trees will generally be mixed with other ground cover, like bare soil, understory vegetation, and forest litter, and will therefore be more challenging to detect. For any given dead tree, this phase may not occur at all, or it could last several years. So, supposing we have a high-resolution remotely sensed image of an area containing dead trees, how might we actually programmatically detect these trees? The most common approach is to use supervised machine learning. In this paradigm, we take some training data, in other words, pixels that we know ahead of time are examples of each of the output classes we care about, and we use them to train some sort of machine learning algorithm to identify each class. We can then feed the machine learning algorithm new, unseen examples. We call these test images, and the algorithm will classify the new examples based on what it learned from the training examples. Often in remote sensing, we want the machine learning algorithm to classify every pixel in a scene, as is done in the example image here. This is called semantic segmentation. However, other tasks, such as classifying the entire image into one or multiple classes, or object detection, are also possible. The user must decide ahead of time which classes they want their trained classifier to output based on their use case. In general, more classes, in particular more classes that are spectrally similar, will make the problem harder and decrease accuracy scores. Few very distinguishable classes will get better scores than many similar classes, even when a very simple machine learning algorithm is used for the more simple example. Note that when we do this, the most straightforward thing to feed the machine learning algorithm, what I would call the feature space, is the reflections of each channel in the remotely sensed image. But we do not have to do this. We could pre-process the training data in whatever manner we feel is best, or add whatever additional data we so choose. And as long as we perform the same pre-processing steps on the test image, the algorithm would function appropriately. There are numerous different types of machine learning algorithms out there. Some of the most modern of these, used to perform image semantic segmentation tasks, include support vector machines, random forests, and neural networks. Briefly, support vector machine seeks to find a series of vectors in a hyperplane that will best separate out each class. Random forest is an ensemble classification method where a large number of decision trees are each given a subset of the data and feature space, and the final class is determined by a plurality vote of the decision trees. Neural networks are modeled off the human brain. The feature space is fed into numerous neurons, often called the hidden layer or hidden layers. Each neuron performs a simple calculation on its inputs. There can be one or several hidden layers of neurons. Typically, the last layer of neurons are fully connected to an output. Each of these algorithms are non-parametric supervised machine learning algorithms. Situationally, each of these algorithms can achieve a very high accuracy on semantic segmentation tasks. However, specifically for high-resolution remote sensing, where there is a lot of contextual information in adjacent pixels, the state-of-the-art algorithm is a convolutional neural network, or CNN. CNNs are actually a special type of neural network that uses a convolution on images. A convolution is just a means of taking in information about adjacent pixels in addition to a single pixel's feature space. Incorporating contextual information can be a very powerful tool to reduce confusion and errors. There are many different types of CNNs built for many different types of tasks and use cases. So another different approach to identifying dead trees is to threshold pixels by vegetation indices. So to explain a vegetation index, I'm going to start with the metaphor of a layer cake. A color image, for example, the picture we take with our phone, is much like a 3-layer cake. The image is made up of 3 separate layers, the amount of red, green, and blue reflectance. So any given pixel in the image will have values for all 3 layers. In remote sensing, we typically call each of these layers a channel. So a vegetation index takes the value of select channels and performs algebraic calculations on them to get a final index value. Most satellite-based remote sensing imagers will have more than 3 channels spanning a greater wavelength range than what the human eye can see. The normalized difference vegetation index, often simply abbreviated as NDVI, is one of the most commonly used vegetation indices in remote sensing. The formula for NDVI is the reflectance of the near-infrared channel minus the reflectance of the red channel divided by the reflectance of the near-infrared channel plus the reflectance of the red channel. You can see that here. The NDVI score is often roughly associated with leaf area and biomass. Another vegetation index, which is particularly useful for identifying red attack trees, is the red-green index, or RGI, which is simply the red reflectance divided by the green reflectance, shown here. This simple vegetation index is useful since red attack crowns would generally have relatively high RGI values compared to the healthy canopies. Generally, the most effective papers using this approach use it in a time series where the change in NDVI and RGI is tracked from some baseline year. Generally, a healthy tree will have a positive to neutral change in NDVI and a negative to neutral change in RGI. In contrast, a red attack tree will have a negative change in NDVI and a positive change in RGI. The trick is to programmatically use the information to identify the red attack trees from healthy ones. One approach is to simply iteratively test thresholds until a threshold on a sample data that best separates out the green and red trees is found. Another common approach is to use an unsupervised machine learning algorithm to cluster the pixels, expecting pixels of green and red attack conifers to naturally fall into different clusters. Regardless, some examples of healthy and red attack pixels are still necessary to tune and separate and understand its accuracy. While the thresholding approach has a nice advantage of being firmly grounded in the expected physical properties and optics of tree death, it does have several considerations that should be made when comparing it to the machine learning approaches. First off, differencing NDVI and RGI may give unexpected results in areas that were not initially healthy tree crowns. A non-vegetated surface, such as soil, could change NDVI and RGI values year to year in ways that could fall into either healthy or dead tree clusters because of small shifts in the sensor location or the solar geometry year to year. Generally, studies avoid this by masking out all non-tree canopy surfaces. But this is an extra step that must be done, and the accuracy of the step also determines the overall accuracy of the model. As already stated, while less examples of the classes of interest are required than in supervised machine learning approaches, this approach does not completely avoid the need to collect field data in order to appropriately set thresholds and verify the accuracy of the results. Whereas the supervised machine learning approaches allow the user to define what classes they are interested in based on the use case. This method is fairly limited to only being able to separate 2 classes of live and red attack mortality, since this is the specific use of the vegetation indices selected. Regardless of whether supervised machine learning or a vegetation index thresholding is used, there are several considerations that must be made when designing such a schema. The first is the sample design for collecting training and validation data. Sampling schemes must be crafted carefully to avoid bias and accurately be able to identify each class. Some classes may not be identifiable from an aerial image and therefore may require field sampling in order to accurately identify. Other classes may only be identified from aerial images. In addition, class balance considerations should carefully be considered. Cover classes rarely occur at approximately equal likelihoods in an image. If a machine learning algorithm is fed imbalanced data, it will likely bias the result towards the more common classes. To make this more concrete, an image will often have more areas of ground cover and soil than red attack tree mortality. However, the end goal is to have a classifier that is equally, if not more adept at identifying red attack tree mortality than these non-tree related classes. If the machine learning algorithm being biased towards the most common classes is not desired, a sampling scheme must determine how to collect the less common classes, while also being financially and logistically practical. Some common techniques are randomly removing some examples of the more common classes from the pool of training data, or designing the sampling scheme in such a way that the less common classes are sampled more frequently. Shade must be carefully considered as well. Shaded pixels are essentially low information parts of the image. A machine learning algorithm may be highly unstable in shaded regions, or it may classify shaded regions as entirely consisting of one class, even though all classes can typically be shaded. Vegetation indices can also be highly unstable in shaded regions. It's also important to assure that training data collected in the field does not represent a highly shaded area in the image. For machine learning approaches, one means of dealing with the shade is to explicitly make it its own class. Another approach is to mask it out based on some minimal required reflectance threshold, although this requires careful tuning of the threshold. CNNs are somewhat less affected by shade than other machine learning approaches, since they may be able to use local context to identify the proper class of the shaded area. Another major source of error is mixed pixels. Even at high spatial resolutions, having pixels that are a combination of several surfaces is inevitable. These combinations can be confusing and be somewhat similar to other cover types. In the example shown here, a pixel that is a combination of green vegetation and soil might look quite similar to red attack mortality. Some studies deal with this by applying a spatial filter to the output classification map, so that a minimum amount of adjacent pixels must also be in the same class. Spectral mixture analysis is a machine learning technique that explicitly attempts to solve this problem, although it likely isn't ideal for high spatial resolution images, where mixed pixels are less common than at lower resolutions. CNNs are an excellent solution to this problem, since the adjacent context can make clear that the image is mixed. Another problem that is particularly common in high-resolution imagery is the variability of pixels within a target. For example, in a single tree crown such as the one shown here, pixels can vary considerably in their brightness due to differences in illumination. For healthy tree crowns, less bright pixels may be spectrally similar to understory vegetation, and highly illuminated understory may be spectrally similar to tree crowns. Similarly, red attack tree crowns and soil can be confused. Similar to mixed pixels, a spatial filter may reduce this problem. Combining multiple pixels together to form a larger pixel, called upsampling, can also reduce this problem, although the fine detail of high-resolution imagery is then lost. CNNs again provide an excellent solution to this problem, since they can use local contextual information to better ascertain what the target is. Another common analysis step is to mask out areas that are clearly not of interest, often man-made surfaces or sheer rock faces. Generally, if information about the location of these surfaces is readily available, masking has no downsides. If cover types that were not part of the training classes are included in the test images, machine learning techniques can act in unexpected ways. For example, a neural network not trained to identify rooftops, but exposed to them in the test data, could be very erratic in which classes the rooftops are identified as, and may not accurately identify its uncertainty about what those surfaces really are. Now, I've talked quite a bit about the potential benefits of modern machine learning tools, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the potential traps as well. I think by far the most dangerous and trickiest problem to diagnose is overfitting and domain generalizability. With neural networks, there are standard practices to prevent overfitting to a training data set using validation data. But I think a bigger potential pitfall is having your entire training and validation environment not match your production environment well. I've listed on this slide some potential factors that might be different between the domain you train and validate your machine learning model on and the production domain. A simple example was training your machine learning model in a forested environment and then expecting it to do well in a desert environment. But differences could be much smaller. Even the same location under different seasons could cause issues for the neural network if one season is not part of the training and validation data set. Neural networks in particular are often very bad at telling you when they're uncertain. So if one is not careful, they can easily become overly trusting of the results they are getting. So let's transition now to detecting moisture stress in leaves. When a leaf becomes moisture stressed, it changes in a number of ways that impact the leaf's reflectance. First, the amount of water within a leaf drops. Secondly, there are changes in the concentration of a number of pigments in the leaf, such as chlorophyll, carotenoids, and anthocyanins. Finally, the stomata of the leaf, which is the opening in the leaf's protective barrier between the chlorophyll within the leaf and the outside world, will tend to be open less frequently and at different times of day, impacting the manner the chlorophyll within the leaf reflects light. So here I'm showing you what's often called a spectral profile. On the x-axis is the wavelength of light being analyzed. For those unfamiliar with wavelength, light the human eye can detect ranges between 380 nanometers, which we perceive as violet, and 700 nanometers, which we perceive as red. On the y-axis is the percentage of light that hits the target that is reflected. So an object we perceive as green might have a relatively high reflectance around 550 nanometers, which is the wavelength associated with green light, and relatively lower reflectances at other parts of the visible spectrum. So I'm showing here a sketch I made of the possible reflectance of green leaf and red leaf between 350 nanometers and 2400 nanometers, which is often considered the end of the near-infrared spectrum. I pointed out several spectral regions which are impacted by some of the factors that change in a leaf when it is water stressed that I mentioned in the previous slide. Carotenoids, anthocyanins, and chlorophyll all impact a leaf's reflectance in the visible spectrum, and change in water and lignocellulose impact near-infrared parts of the spectrum. Tree stress is a very generic term, and when one is trying to identify it, they need to think carefully about what exactly they're trying to detect. In the past couple of slides, I've mostly been honing in on moisture stress. But even in a drought, this is not necessarily the only type of stress that is possible. For example, a defoliator or sapsucker might take advantage of a tree's reduced natural defenses and attack a tree. This will most definitely cause the tree stress and could even kill the tree. But the signal a remote sensing device would get from the stressor would be very different from what one might expect from drought stress. The exact form of stress being identified is going to determine the instrumentation and methods needed to detect it. Regardless of the stressor, the shift in spectral signal is going to be more subtle than identifying a classic red attack mortality tree. All commonly available high spatial resolution satellites currently are multispectral satellites, meaning they generally have 4 to 12 channels, and each channel is fairly broad, typically at least 100 nanometers in width, sometimes several hundred. Multispectral imaging is often contrasted with imaging spectroscopy, often also called hyperspectral imaging. Imaging spectroscopy typically contains hundreds of channels, and each channel is fairly narrow, often 10 nanometers or less. As already noted, the shifts in the leaves' reflectance during drought are subtle, and often the shift only happens within tens of nanometers. This means that using imaging spectroscopy is the only reliable manner of determining many forms of stress. Now, there are no commercially available high spatial resolution imaging spectrometers, but in my estimation of industry trends, there are likely to be some in the near future. Generally, in the scientific literature, even for subtle stress signals, multispectral imagers will be able to detect changes better than chance, but they will have nowhere near the accuracy that imaging spectroscopy might. The main take home here is some vendors were making some strong claims about their ability to track tree stress through time. I would take these claims with a bit of a grain of salt. The best the vendors can do is track a vegetation index like NDVI through time, and therefore have a rough estimate of how leaf area is changing through time. Now, a tree losing leaf area through time is certainly a strong stress signal, but the vendors are not able to track more subtle signals of stress, and leaf drying with the spectral information they have available currently. Regardless of the imaging device used, the spectral signal of stress is going to be subtle enough that some steps are almost certainly going to need to be done before stress can be identified with any accuracy. First, tree crowns will need to be separated from other cover types in the image. Trying to separate out stress levels and identify which areas are tree crowns versus which areas are some other cover type in a single step is likely going to lead to poor results. Generally, the problem would be much simpler if as a first step, tree crowns are separated from the rest of the image, and the algorithm is only given known crown areas to try to detect stress signals in. Another important consideration is that species will likely need to be identified first. Different species have different leaf shapes, phenologies, and crown shapes, all of which will impact the spectral signal of the crown. The same spectral signal from two separate species might be indicative of extreme stress in one species and perfect health in another. Therefore, it is important to reduce that noise by separating out species before trying to delve into the stress of species. Time series analysis is also highly likely to improve results. Even within species, spectral signals between trees could vary quite a bit for factors not related to acute tree stress. The most successful attempts at delving into stress almost always involve establishing a baseline for each tree crown and then looking at trajectories of spectral signals through time. Now, I wanted to hone in on some physical stress signals and the accuracy we expect to detect them with both multispectral imagery and imaging spectroscopy. Defoliation and leaf wilt will have relatively strong spectral signals over relatively broad bands. The removal of leaf area, if strong enough, can generally be detected with multispectral indices such as NDVI. Imaging spectroscopy will likely detect the level of leaf removal, and if it is initially occurring with more sensitivity. However, depending on the use case, the accuracy obtained from multispectral sensors could be sufficient. In contrast, detecting green attack mortality trees or water loss is going to be much more subtle spectral signal, occurring over much finer spectral ranges. Some studies have been able to obtain better than chance accuracy at detecting green attack mortality with multispectral imagery alone, but the accuracy is nowhere near an operational level. Even using imaging spectroscopy, there is mixed results in studies as to whether the accuracy is high enough to be used in an operational manner. But I think it is certainly possible that an experienced vendor would be able to come up with an operational solution and an applied use case for water loss or green attack mortality. Finally, I wanted to talk a bit about my review of the vendors in this space. At a high level, many vendors are offering fairly similar products. They generally are using some combination of high spatial resolution, remote sensing, machine learning, generally CNNs, and time series analysis to produce their products. Most vendors were understandably protective about the exact machine learning algorithms and inputs they were using. Most vendors have an app which allows for easy communication and mapping between the vendor, power companies, and third-party tree maintenance services. Most vendors can easily refresh their product fairly rapidly, up to a weekly basis. However, generally speaking, purchasing the satellite image is the most expensive aspect of the vendor's pipeline, so it's best to make sure the repeat time that you want matches your cost and project needs. For more specific details about each vendor, I suggest you look over the written report. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and this concludes my presentation.